I'm never gonna give up. Fall down, I just gotta get up, yeah. Cause this is my road. Let's camera action.
You're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show on WNHH LP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.
Good morning, everyone, and a blessed morning to all of you, whether you're listening live or whether you listen to this recording afterwards. Thanks to WNHH 103.5 FM, we're able to broadcast live on a variety of platforms, but also my shows are archived on Facebook. Just go to Tom Ficklin Radio Show. You'll have an opportunity to listen. And even if you're listening live right now and have to move away, don't feel you're going to lose anything, because you can always come back. It's kind of an on-demand platform. Really a sincere pleasure today to have Dr. Onimia Obuago with us. He's Associate Professor of Medicine at the Yale School of Medicine, as well as Reverend Dr. Leroy Perry, pastor of St. Stephen's AME Zion Church here in Brantford, in the New England region, for those of you that are not familiar with Brantford. And Reverend Perry leads I mentioned Reverend Perry in a promo this morning, that you're leading a crusade, a vanguard, kind of an abolitionist movement for abolishing ignorance and instilling education in people. Public health, as the official title is Cultural Ambassadors for the Yale Clinical Research Program. Dr. O is with us, and you've heard of Dr. Fauci and you've heard of other people, but Dr. O is someone who is just as famous, in my standpoint. He doesn't like this famous the accolades. I know he doesn't, but I have the mic, Dr. O. But the fact that somebody had to lead the vaccine trials for COVID-19 at the Yale Center for Clinical Investigation, and that person happens to be you. You're also the primary investigator for the pediatric studies for 12 to 15-year-olds. And although we don't want to talk much about 6 months, but we know about 5-year-olds to 11-year-olds. But also you're involved with the trials before that with the 6-month folks. So it's really from I don't mean to be somber, but from cradle to grave that you're involved with this research for this pandemic, epidemic, world problem, crisis that we all are kind of encountering. And you're one of the solution bearers. You're also a prayerful person in terms of putting your prayer and your faith into action. So Dr. O, you were with us a little over a year ago, and you talked about some of the earlier stages of the vaccine trials. And certainly since that time, I've been involved with social media for several decades. And I have to tell you, my field of communication and marketing has failed the consumer worldwide in terms of getting out straight messages and clear messages. But you were with us a little year ago. We have a chance now for an update. What's developed since that time?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, thanks for having me again, Tom, on your show. And I think this is an important medium for us to get the word out. So I think, like Reverend Perry, you're also working hard to eradicate ignorance and misinformation about the COVID-19 vaccine. Looking back at last year, or when last I came on this show, it feels like 10 years ago, because a lot of stuff has happened between the last time we spoke and now. Some very important questions have been answered. I think that we've seen, for example, what the efficacy of the vaccines have been, not just immediately after the shots were given, but now we've seen what the data is 6 months out. And that's where we found that the vaccines continue to protect very well against the more severe forms of the disease. So, the things like symptomatic disease that will cause people to be hospitalized, as well as, unfortunately getting seriously ill and dying, which is amazing. So the vaccines have held out quite well. The other questions we've tried to answer over time is just the durability of the protection that the vaccines confer. And I think that we all have followed the information around the booster studies. And so we did the booster studies, and the question was, even though we're seeing immunity wane over time, what does that mean for an individual's risk of getting COVID again? And is there a role for an additional vaccine to be able to blunt that? And so we did booster studies. We took a quarter of people that we had in the original Pfizer trials, and we gave them boosters or no booster. And we actually found that those who got boosters had about a 96% lower rate of having new COVID infections compared to those who didn't have boosters. And that's why some of this information has gone to the FDA to support some of that. And then other things we're continuing to do, like you rightly mentioned, is I think we started to see data emerge around pregnant women. Some of the concerns people had about the vaccine safety in pregnancy. Now there are cohorts showing that the vaccines do not show any signal of any harm around premature births or adverse pregnancy outcomes or even birth defects of kids who are born, and that provides greater reassurance. I don't know if people know, but over 3/4 of healthcare workers in the United States who are exposed to COVID-19 are women. Women rule the world when it comes to the healthcare system. And so, having, especially those who are young and women of childbearing potential, and especially being on the front line caring for patients with COVID, I think this was really great information for them to have around the vaccine safety in pregnancy. And then two more things. One other thing we're doing now is also mix and match studies. So we're trying to see if we can get to try different vaccine types to see if one mix and match approach is better than others. So, for example, we're working with Sanofi as a booster to people who received Pfizer, Moderna, and some of the other vaccine approaches. And I think that'll be important to see if combination vaccine approaches may be more effective than receiving just a single vaccine. And then, like you rightly said, we continue to look at vaccines in kids. We have just reported data on 5 to 11. I know we'll have time to talk about that in a little more detail, but you're right also. We've enrolled a cohort from 6 months all the way through less than 5 years old, and we're hoping in the coming weeks that we should have some results to report.
Dr. O, elaborate a little bit more, even if you have to repeat exactly what you said in terms of I think folks, they get so hung up on, I got 1 shot, I got 2 shots, why didn't they tell me I wouldn't need another one? I don't think people appreciate that since you've been involved with this for 4 years, 2, 3 years, roughly, give me an idea.
2 years.
2 years. And I don't think people appreciate that it's not that once you had the first IE discovery, you didn't stop. You don't stop there. That kind of inspires you to continue to research and find out the effectiveness and to continue to examine. You don't just stop, you knew that you hadn't found the Holy Grail just at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, sometimes the more you discover, the more questions you unearth. And so we've talked about the vaccine showing great efficacy. Then the question is, does it show the same efficacy for everyone by race or ethnicity, by body composition, by underlying medical conditions? How long does that immunity last? Do we need to give a booster? When we give the booster, how long would this be? And then we're confronting, community anxieties around the question of, would this be an annual vaccination, or would this be something we need to get every 6 months? And honestly, we don't have all the answers yet, but the studies are ongoing. Many of these studies are running for at least 2 years from now. And so we'll continue to follow the patients we've vaccinated, continue to look for long-term safety signals, and also look to see how long the immunity lasts and how much protection it confers. There's so many variables there. I mean, it's hard to predict. I think that what we're seeing now is that there continues to be a rising number of cases, especially in the past week or two in the United States, and that has us very concerned. Because whatever happens in Europe tends to happen in the United States, a couple of weeks to months later. And we're seeing Europe, including in countries that have relatively high rates of vaccinations, still having a lot of cases to contend with. So many of us are very concerned about going into the later part of the fall and winter about what the picture will be in the United States. So we're not resting on our oars. There's still a lot of work to be done. And honestly, even beyond the breakthroughs we've made in vaccines, there have been very huge breakthroughs in treatment, so that for those who are not vaccinated or those who are vaccinated and respond poorly, if they do become ill, there's really blockbuster therapies like monoclonal antibodies that have received emergency use authorization. And now there's actually, the downside of monoclonals are they're either giving subcutaneously, so they're injectables, or as intravenous drugs. Now they're pills, oral pills, that have been shown to be quite effective if given early to protect people against being hospitalized and dying. So we have preventative drugs, and now we have better treatment drugs. So I hope that takes the bites that even out of COVID-19, that even if there are more cases, that there'll be much less severe disease.
Indeed, so important. Reverend Perry, I want to bring you in really quickly here in the early part of the show, because Dr. O has really splendidly articulated the aggressiveness, the diligence, the the commitment of the medical profession to do no harm and to save us. But the anxiety, I was just curious, Dr. Perry, in terms of the anxiety and still the, not necessarily hesitancy, but sometimes the confusion that do you still, what's your sense of the pulse of people's confusion or anxiety, or just understanding why they need to be, to love one another by practicing safe practices?
I think that what we're facing is our biggest challenge is the ignorance that seems to be prevailing within our community. And it's coming from every quarter. It's coming from, I heard a minister in New Haven just recently talking about why we should not take the vaccine. And we have doctors who are doing the same thing. So, and then with the Colin Powell thing, and then with the breakthroughs, people are really confused. So one of the reasons that we asked Dr. Onyema to be on to come and talk to us is because we need clarity from the scientific community for our members so that we can have a rational, reasonable, and scientific foundation as we move forward with this pandemic. And so I'm just so happy that that we're doing these shows. And Tom, I'm hoping that before we finish this show today, that you will ask that question that you raised before we started the show about faith, religion, and Dr. O's commitment. I thought that was just awesome, because we are a people of faith. And when you talk to us, you hit us at where we live when you start with the faith. And so Dr. Onyema not only has faith on one hand, he has medicine in the other. That's a powerful combination.
Well, Dr. O, with your permission, we did kind of review some of the questions, and we have 45 remaining minutes. Would you like to respond to that now? Because we were talking about the connection between, I was listening, for example, to the Reverend Perry, the pastor at Trinity in Chicago, the Yale Divinity School grad. What's his name?
Moss?
Yeah, Reverend Otis Moss III. Just yesterday, because you can go online and hear his sermon, he talked about the false duality between science and religion. That was his sermon yesterday, the false duality between science and religion. That there is no separation when you really consider the mystery as well as the pragmatism of social organization. So Dr. O, yesterday you did have a chance to present at the Church, and so the issue, and this is not a show that's trying to evangelize people. This is not a show designed to convince people to believe in one thing or the other. But we just got to share our human experience and our academic experience and our educational experience as we see it. So would you like to chat about the connection from your standpoint between science and religion and mystery and universe, but also from a practical medical standpoint? I mean, when you look at the medical symbol, doctors work, and we have healing obviously in many of our wisdom texts, but at any rate, I don't want to put too many more words in your mouth. Would you like to comment on this mystery of the universe, but how we can actually participate in, if not solving the mystery, being in harmony with the universal impulses?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I don't think we have enough time to do justice to that, because it's really quite profound, but I want to just make a few points. First is just really to let people know that people of faith do engage in science. I think that that's really an important thing to mention. The NIH director, I think Dr. Collins, does talk about his faith, and there's so many of us in the scientific community that do have faith and believe in a higher power and in God. And we see the mystery of life and even in science, where we see just the diversity of creation, of organisms and how they interact, and just the amount of order and uniformity in the universe that can only be ascribed to a thoughtful, a higher power. And so it's really important, because I think, I think there's a false dichotomy between, science and God. Remember that many of us who work in the field of medicine and science, do have our inspiration from God. And I think even our intellectual capacities, our creativity, all draw from the gifts and talents and abilities that God has given us. And so I get disheartened when I hear Christians say that they wouldn't take a medicine or go see a doctor because they think that God is not in it. You know, there's a scripture that says that, you know, I wish above all things that you may be in health, even as your soul prospers. And God really desires that we have holistic health in every way, our spirits, our minds, our souls, and bodies. And even in medicine, we recognize that there's components of human beings that we can't touch with medicines that have to do with people's well-being. There are aspects of life and creation and diversity, like I mentioned, that can only come from God. So I'd like to encourage, you know, everyone that, you know, God is in science, science draws from God, and we shouldn't really draw false distinctions between those.
Thanks for sharing that. And again, we'll do, did Reverend Perry, did Dr. O answer your questions sufficiently?
He held back a little bit, but
we'll do another show, but it's important because as people think about these existential questions, I mean, we're in this moment of what does it mean to be alive and to be a brother's keeper and to love one another, given the information we have available. So, you know, from my bias standpoint, if someone is not vaccinated, they're actually potentially complicit to a murder. They can kill someone else by their feeling that they're immune, so to speak. On the immunity issue, Dr. O, talk about, because again, there's this confusion about boosters and you referenced earlier kind of the complexities and the complexities and things that we do not know about how the body interacts with the external environment. But talk about boosters for a second. Because some people are saying, "Oh, now does it mean I'm going to have to get a fourth booster or annual?" Or
yeah, great question. So I think it's really important because what we did notice is that even for people who've recovered from COVID and subsequently when we started to vaccinate people, was that usually about the 4 to 6 month mark or so, people start to become vulnerable again to reinfection. And that's important because there's this false word out there that if you've recovered from COVID, you're fine and you have no risk for COVID moving forward and you don't need a vaccine. That's inaccurate. I mean, we find that, you know, after about a couple of months that both natural immunity, which you acquire from having COVID-19, or vaccine immunity starts to wane. There's excellent data from population level, millions of people followed over time from places like Israel that have very great national level data that immunity tends to wane, you know, 4 to 6 months after you receive the complete primary vaccination series. And so because of that, that's where the whole issue around boosting the immune system. So these are people who responded to the initial, you know, vaccination series, and and so do they need another shot to boost their immune system to restore what was lost and to restore the robust protection that they had? And we're seeing both those issues, that they do wane. The booster works to boost the immune system, and we see the clinical effects of that, which are then you start to see that vulnerability to getting a new infection or reinfected drops after getting a booster. So just to clarify, booster and third shot. So what we have known since the primary series, so this is 2 doses of the Moderna or the Pfizer vaccine, that some people don't respond even after they get 2 doses of those vaccines. And as you can imagine, it makes common sense that these are immune deficient people. So people who are on treatments like steroids or other medications that ab initio prevent that individual from responding to any vaccine. There are conditions like HIV, especially when it's untreated or advanced, or people who have cancer who are getting chemotherapy. So even when they get those 2 shots of a vaccine, they don't respond. So that's where the third shot comes in. The third shot is that effort to try to even cause them to respond to that initial series of vaccines. So that's where the third shot comes. And actually, some of us believe that some groups, like even transplant patients, may benefit from a 4th shot, you know, so that, and I think one gap in the field is looking at higher dose vaccines, because for other conditions like influenza, for example, we know that vulnerable people like elderly, for example, we give them higher doses than the general population because of that lower responsiveness. So that's where the extra shots come in. But the boosters, I would say, at least to keep the terminology clean, is that for those who responded appropriately to the initial vaccines, because that immunity wanes over time, then there's a need for a booster at least 6 months out.
I'm kind of just going to go through not necessarily a scatter shot, because so many questions I want to ask and want to maximize the 40 or so minutes we have remaining. Some folks have mentioned to me that they were confused in terms of the booster. They got Moderna, could they get a Pfizer booster? They got Pfizer, could they get a Moderna booster? Are they interchangeable? Does it matter?
Yeah, so what we do know is that it seems that the mRNA vaccines, so Pfizer and Moderna, tend to do well as unique vaccine schedules. So if you got Pfizer, you get Pfizer, you're fine. If you got Moderna, get a third and Moderna, you're fine. For now, we don't select which vaccine you get. So if you got 2-dose Moderna, you get Pfizer, that's probably okay, because now we have mix and match data from the NIH that suggests that mixing and matching the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines is not problematic. A combination that tends to be a little different would be if you got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It seems that if you get the Pfizer or Moderna as a booster, that you tend to have better responses than getting the second the booster with a viral vector vaccine, which is like the Johnson & Johnson. So I think an argument could be made. But for now, I don't think that even the CDC is recommending any booster above another. We do look at some of the data, and it appears that the better combination for those who received Johnson & Johnson to begin with may be an mRNA, but they still get good protection if they get a booster 2 months later, or second dose 2 months later, with the same vaccine. So again, I think for now, just to make it as straightforward as possible, whatever booster you can use is fine, but I think that the Pfizer and Moderna have an edge over J&J.
Excellent. And Dr. Perry, I want to kind of be really loose, use that expression somewhat loosely, but not too loosely, for you to jump in if as a thought process occurs to you, because there's just so much when I see Dr. O in front of me and all the conversations I've had with people and webinars I've attended where this is so critical. So Dr. O, it seems to me that what people have heard about now, 5 to 11-year-olds and vaccinations, but I think people have forgotten about that there were trials to determine the efficacy for 5 to 11-year-olds. I think people just forget that this is not an overnight decision. Talk a little bit about, if you will, about why the 5 to 11 is so important and the trials that took place and the evidence that you were able to uncover.
Yeah, so that's a good point. I think that the trials in kids are ongoing. One of the reasons why I think vaccinating kids is critically important is, we all know that kids don't get as sick or die, even though there's been a couple of hundred kids and thousands of kids who've been hospitalized with COVID since the pandemic. And, tens of thousands of kids, even in Connecticut, have been infected with COVID. And we don't fully understand or are still studying what the long-term effects for those kids have and will be. So again, when we did the studies in kids, I think that given that the vaccines are a known commodity or known vaccine now, given that we've used it in hundreds of millions of adults globally, I think that in and of itself should provide reassurance that even for adults as well as older adolescents, right, the 16 to 17-year-olds that we used it in first, that the vaccines remain quite safe in those groups. But it was really important for us to look at younger groups. And one of the big scientific questions was, do the young people need the same dose of the vaccine that the adults get, or do they need a lower dose? Because, one thing we try to work very hard to do in the trials is we want to give you just enough to get you where you need to be with your immune system to protect you against COVID, but also to use as little as possible so we can mitigate the side or adverse effects. So that was the big issue with kids. And so even before we rolled out the larger trials in the 5 to 11-year-olds, there was a dose ranging study. So we looked at different doses in a small number of kids to let us look at the safety in those individuals. And then that's how we selected the dose for the much larger trials in kids. And eventually we enrolled about 4,500 kids across the different study sites within just the 5 to 11-year-old demographics. We're also doing another 4,500 within the 6 months to less than 5-year demographic. And so very critical to those studies was safety monitoring. So we vaccinated these kids, we collected diaries from them as to the symptoms that they had. We continue to follow them over time, to look for safety signals. And, it's really been, really reassuring that we haven't yet had a vaccine-related serious adverse event. I think that sometimes the COVID vaccines are held to such a high standard because you can't imagine that there's any vaccine we use for preventing of any disease that wouldn't have like a little bit of a rare, low frequency side effect. But I think even with the high standard that some of these vaccines have been held to, it's just amazing to see even with the rollout that they've been fine. One of my concerns, though, is that in spite of the data we have, right, so that the vaccines are safe in those kids, we actually did report about a 90% efficacy in those kids in regards to preventing symptomatic disease, even though that's not what we were looking for. We were looking for safety because we know the vaccine works. But even while we looked for safety, we looked at the number of cases that occurred in those who received vaccine and those who received the dummy vaccine and still found very robust protection. My concern is that parents are much more hesitant. So there are many parents who receive the vaccine themselves, but they'll be like, I'm not quite sure I should give it to my kids. It shows up in the polls, where especially for younger kids, in some cases, a slight majority of US parents will not vaccinate their kids. Now, why is this important from a public health standpoint? Again, we've seen that even with high vaccination coverage rates, that the virus continues to spread, right? We're almost hitting 100,000 cases weekly average in the United States. That's going back up, And so what is pretty clear is that we need to vaccinate upwards of 90% of the population for us to get anywhere close. And we're only about 60% now. So there are 28 million kids within the 5 to 11 demographic. That's a huge chunk of the US population. If we're gonna get closer to reducing the risk of community transmission, we're going to have to try to vaccinate as many people as possible. I think the latest is that 47 million people in the United States are yet to be vaccinated. So vaccinating kids gets us a step closer to that.
Mm-hmm. Reverend Perry, any thoughts? I have a few follow-up questions, but I wanted to wonder what machinations are going on in the beauty of your mind.
I'm just impressed at the diligence that the medical community, and not only the medical community, but now we're seeing more state and federal agencies who are requiring at least that you get vaccinated or that you bring a COVID test. I think that shows some due diligence on the part of our officials. And as one of the Pfizer early on trial persons,
that's right.
I was so happy to be one of the ones who was offered the booster shot, because as Dr. O mentioned, our fraternity, our seniors need to have have some protection as well. And the shot went very well. I had no side effects. It was smooth, it was seamless, but I had the assurance of knowing that, I don't get a test every month to find out whether the antibodies were working in me or not, but there's a scientific community that's already doing that study, so they should know. And so I followed their lead. And, with the holidays coming up, I think the people who've gotten this booster and the people who've gotten their shots will at least have some relief in meeting with, because we can't be isolated from our families forever and our friends. We have to come together. We have to be able to sit and have meals together and conversations together. And I think, it's our responsibility to care for our parents and our children as well as ourselves. So, I just think that it's important that we're having this conversation with Dr. O, and the mere fact that he's already made it clear that you can take a mixed booster shot, that young people there hasn't shown to be any really ill effects of young people taking this, even through the trials. I think we're moving in the right direction. And hopefully with the faith community and the medical community working together, we can put a dent in this pandemic.
Well said. Dr. O, talk about masks for a second. There still seems to be some dispute about the efficacy of masks, whether you should wear it or not, or Does it do any good? Just any thoughts in that regard?
Yeah, so there's, I think we went from the point where it was really scientific conjecture. It makes sense when people yell, scream, shout, sneeze, cough, they expel these respiratory droplets. Some of them are so tiny, they can, go like so many feet, they can spread to ventilation systems. We then really have evidence that the virus can be transmitted, through airborne routes, which is scary for us because droplets are much more heavy. They fall over shorter distances. Airborne particles can go really far and result in transmission. And so, I think, we've always known, or at least made sense that masks should work. But now there's a lot of evidence suggesting that masks halt transmission. The CDC reported on a couple of studies around, for example, schools that enforced universal masking, and those who didn't have such a policy, and the number of school-related outbreaks were lower in some of those systems where they had masks involved or not. There was even a large population level studies, which was a really elegant study, I think, from either from Europe or Asia, I forget exactly which one, where they did community level masking. So they looked at different jurisdictions that had much more mask wearing and those who didn't, and they found much more community transmission where there was less masking. So I think we've moved from do they work, or is there evidence for that, to there is enough hard evidence in different settings, community settings, in school systems, etc., that masking works. And I think especially because we've all talked about where uptake of vaccines is not perfect. Remember, there are many parts of the world in Africa. At some point, I think many countries are still below 3% vaccinated in their countries. So masking is that public health intervention that's really effective in protecting spread, especially when some of these effective interventions like vaccines haven't taken as much hold as we hope that they would. So my message to the community is, listen, I understand the challenges with masking. I understand parents' concerns about their kids going masks to all the time. I get that, but these are unusual times. These are unprecedented situations. And I think we all have that collective responsibility. And I like how both of you have used the term being your brother's keeper. And one way, again, even as a person of faith, that we show love and concern for one another in a community is to protect each other. We have a right not there to allow ourselves fall ill. The problem with COVID-19 is that when you fall ill, you can pass along that infection to someone else, and someone who's vulnerable. Sometimes I wonder, how many people have died? How many grandpas and grandmas, how many immune compromised people, cancer patients in a household or something, died of COVID because maybe they got their shots, but they didn't respond to it, right? Because they're immune compromised, but someone introduced COVID into their system and they paid the price for it. So there's a bit of community collective responsibility, and dare I say, even potential patriotism in really just joining the movement, mask up, let's protect each other. It's not going to be forever. We hope, that as the vaccines catch up, as the vaccines take hold, that hopefully this will fizzle out at some point. But till we get there, we all need to mask up, keep our hand hygiene, physical distance where possible, and just avoid, large indoor gatherings, because you never know who's vaccinated and who's not. I think that we need to still keep onto what is now a clear evidence base that masks, reduce reduce transmission of COVID.
Excellent. And as you say, go ahead, Reverend Perry, please.
Yeah, Dr. O, I think that is really, really important for people who are making the assumption that even though that they're saying, oh, well, they took the vaccine and they died of COVID. I think you've made it clear twice on the show that they've had other immune compromises. And I mean, even with Colin Powell, the anti-vaxxers were saying, you see, you're gonna get COVID whether you take the vaccine or not, or they don't want to look at the deeper issues of immune compromise that many people already have. The vaccine, it can't cure all of our diseases and all of our immunities or immune compromises. But what it does is that it does offer protection. And I think that, we have to demystify that assumption that whether you get the vaccine or not, you still can have a breakthrough, or you still are going to be that that the vaccine doesn't work, basically.
Yeah, so let me just quickly respond to that, right? So out of the 200 or so million people who are vaccinated in the US, there have been only about 10,000, add some numbers to that, breakthrough infection. So if you do the math, right, 10,000 out of 200 million, that's close to 0.0000 something. So even, breakthrough infections get a lot of press, but the frequency at which they're occurring is not even less than 1%. It's not even less than 0.1%. It's much, much tinier than that. And more importantly, many of these breakthrough infections are non-fatal, right? They're just in milder forms of the disease, which I think, if anything, the message should be that the low rate of breakthrough infections is a confirmation that the vaccines are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. Now, let's talk about Colin Powell, because that's someone from our community, right, who succumbed to that. If you had to choose one of the medical conditions or underlying conditions that an individual would have that would severely prevent their ability to mount a response to a full series of vaccinations, it would be multiple myeloma. Multiple myeloma is a disease, a blood disease that actually affects the cells that produce antibodies to anything. And so, he's exactly the kind of patient who should be unable to produce responses to the vaccine. And I think this happened a few days before he was scheduled to get his booster or third shot of the vaccine. And so I think that, understanding some of these underlying issues that increase a person's vulnerability to COVID-19 are important. And again, we continue to wish, and pray for his family.
Dr. O, since I had the mic, and again, you don't like to be outed, but you were the primary investigator. It seems to me that medical schools will start using your journey from a case study standpoint. I mean, you are already in the history books is the point I'm trying to make. Whether you want to admit it or not. This for medical history and research and academic kind of viewpoints, this is a very cogent moment in terms of where the medical profession is going and the community is going. How did you become the primary investigator? You certainly did not wake up that morning of this 2 years ago and say, did you have to apply? Are there politics involved? Has it been fulfilling for you?
Yeah. All right. Reverend Perry said I held back the last time, so maybe I should say maybe God did it. So I think there's a powerful message from my story. I think, so I run a clinical trials program and I focus mostly on HIV. And I always like to remind people that like COVID, HIV also disproportionately affects, people of color, the minorities in our community. We've always understood disparities in care. We've always understood how health literacy impacts patient outcomes. And so it's just really interesting to see a lot of those same issues play out with COVID-19. So many of the issues that some people are just waking up to are things that those of us in the field have been very well aware of for decades. And then also, running a clinical trials program, one of the things I do, and I think my contribution to HIV medicine is in therapeutics. So I've always run clinical trials looking at novel compounds to treat HIV. And so it's just been gratifying over the years to really see a fatal condition transformed into a very manageable condition. And now we're going beyond having, just single pill regimens, take one tablet once a day and you'll be fine kind of thing, to even long-acting therapies. So that was my milieu and that's what I did. Now, when COVID hit, as you can imagine, that upended everything for all of us. It actually interrupted some of the HIV research we're doing. But then guess what? I think the moment was just right. I think there's a scripture that says, we're prepared for a time such as this, especially when it came to, I think, Esther in the Bible, right? And so, for me, it was exactly having the exact right skill set. I had the staff I needed to run clinical trials and an environment like Yale and YCCI that supports the work I do, and even the cultural ambassadors that allowed us to reach out to racial ethnic minorities. So it's almost like it fell into my lap and matched and aligned perfectly with my skill set. And so that's how we got into vaccine research. You know about the vaccine research, but you don't know also about some of the work I've done in HIV therapeutics, for example, with even advancing remdesivir for the treatment of COVID-19. So we did the treatment studies first, and then we pivoted to vaccines. So what I tell people sometimes, and if it's just a life lesson, is keep chomping at the bit. Do what you're good at. Keep working in your laboratory. Keep doing the good ones. Keep doing what you're passionate about. But sometime an opportunity will arise that calls on your skills to be used and your talent. And so this just really fell into my lap, and it's just been a pleasure to throw myself and immerse myself into really trying to deal with what's the plague of our time, and working in our own little space to try and contribute to making a difference through treatments. And that's why sometimes I say that our science can be the best, but if people don't use the science, right, then we don't really achieve the maximum impact that it should have. And so that's why, beyond just doing some of the trials, it's really been my mission to get the word out to our communities that these vaccines, they're very well done, very well designed trials, they're safe. I vaccinated my 10-year-old daughter. It's on my Twitter feed. Maybe I'll get a few more followers after this. But what I'm trying to say is that, these are the breakthroughs that we've looked for people of faith, right? I think, again, just to quote, I think Reverend Perry in the past, right? Like, we prayed for a miracle, we prayed for a turnaround, and guess what? The miracle came, and some people just don't recognize it and want to use it.
Dr. O, I really appreciate your being so transparent and sharing. We spoke in the past that we may not, and I want you to correct me because time has passed, that we may not ever eliminate COVID per se, and there might be flare-ups, but our response has to be more strategic and laser-like, and even like that immediate response. So will we ever have a day where there's no COVID? Will there be occasional flare-ups like a forest fire, have to put it out? What are your thoughts about the future as we look into the crystal ball?
Yeah, so I think we've all made predictions that we've had to pull back from, but I think based on what we know, we can probably predict that the SARS-CoV-2 will be with us, for a while. There are other seasonal coronaviruses that have joined part of that endemic cycle of flaring up during the fall and winter and then fizzling out during the warmer months. Word of caution is, especially when it comes to seasonality, we saw that, we had COVID cases in warm months, we had them in cold months. So I don't think for now we can attribute seasonality yet to the virus. I think it seems to be defying some of that. But I think part of it is it's a new virus where, initially it was really just a new introduction into the world and into our communities. And so nobody had pre-existing immunity. But as we start to vaccinate more people, as people get sick and recover, there's a possibility that the virus will continue to linger, but hopefully not at very high levels, but there'll be low level community transmission. And I think people are starting to define the number of cases per 10,000 or 100,000 below which, if it falls, you no longer would consider COVID a pandemic or epidemic. I hope that we get there. So I think the goal now may not be eradicating COVID. I think the goal here is really to just control the community transmission. So I think it will probably be with us for a couple of years down the road. I think that some of the advances in treatments and vaccines would make less people vulnerable to it. And if for those who do get it, will make it a much more lethal disease. I think that those are probably safe predictions for now.
Dr. O, can I just say this, Tom? Dr. O, I think you mentioned to me yesterday, it's like lessons learned. So from what you've learned with the HIV science and what we've learned with the COVID vaccine, is that lessons learned help us prepare for things yet to come and things that may already be out there, that this vaccine, and we don't even know whether or not it might have effects to even do some good there. You want to just mention that just a little for us?
Yeah, great point. So what I will say is that I think COVID has been a stress test to systems. So we've learned that, some of us in the most resource settings, who would have known that a very well-developed medical healthcare system could just be so devastated and just really be shown to be really inadequate in the way we've handled COVID-19, from failures with even getting the right test and ramping up testing, the right way. We've politicized every political public health response we've had, and it's also revealed how poorly we treat certain parts of our community. So those are lessons that we've learned from this. But I think even more exciting are some of the lessons we're going to carry from some of the new approaches we've learned to preventing disease. So for example, for the COVID-19 vaccines, the mRNA vaccine technology, this is the first time mRNA vaccines have been used in a large scale for any infectious disease. And guess what? There are already trials kicking off for HIV and other medical conditions using the same mRNA technology. And even there's even some Yale researchers have worked on an mRNA vaccine cocktail that can protect against tick bites and some of the pathogens that they could potentially carry. So you are going to hear a ton about application of some of these new vaccine approaches, mRNA and viral vector. In fact, mRNA technology could also be used for cancers. Right. So, the applications of some of these approaches we've learned will serve us well for so many disease conditions. And I think that will be a strong legacy of the COVID-19 response.
Excellent question. Dr. O, just elaborate a little more, if you would, when people hear this word or phrase mRNA, how did it emerge and why wasn't it discovered earlier? Or, I'm so excited just to hear you talking about the potential future applications. But in the consumer mind, and we don't always read the JAMA, we don't really always listen to AMA webinars. We're hearing these terms. People are the good thing in my mind is people have never been so concerned about health. Looking at the half bit, the water being at the glass being half full. I'm excited about people's interest in health. We've never had such, but now we got to kind of make sure it's a sincere and intelligent interest. But why was this mRNA thing, was it just laying on the shelf and someone said, how did it kind of emerge? And people are confused about, well, why didn't we do it 10 years ago or 3 years ago?
Yeah.
The genesis, if you will.
Yeah, so mRNA technology has actually been going on for a while. The problem with mRNA and the reason why it hadn't made it to prime time was it's a very delicate structure and a structure that's broken down very easily. So it's taken a lot of decades of tweaking of the mRNA to get it to the point where, it was, let me say, pharmacologically stable so that you gave it and it wasn't broken down by the body. So they figured out a way to package the messenger RNA. So for example, with the Pfizer Moderna vaccines, they're actually packaged in fat. So they use very, like lipid nanoparticles. So they coat the mRNA so that when it's injected, it's not degraded or broken down immediately until it gets to the target cell, which is very fascinating. And they found ways to tweak the structure so that it wasn't impacting the immune system robustly, because one of the downsides of mRNA, if you didn't do it right, was you could just cause the immune system to be hyperactivated. So it's been taking many years of percolating science to tweak the molecule where it didn't drive the immune system crazy, where it lasted sufficiently to be able to achieve what it would be done. And, frankly, some of the trials for mRNA started in the early 2000s, actually. There's one of the early studies was a messenger RNA vaccine for rabies, which was a phase 1 study in humans. So that's been percolating. And then they looked at it for diseases like Ebola, for example. So it's always been there. I think, again, this is a coincidence of timing where messenger RNA technology was just gotten right at about the time COVID hit. And so many of the things were on the shelf. And the beauty of, and ready to roll out, and the beauty of mRNA vaccines is that it's such a adaptable technology. Messenger RNA is just a template that makes body produce proteins. So if there's any disease that's protein driven, or if there's any protein to target that can make a disease better, you can make messenger RNA for it. So it's just such a broad tool that can be used in medicine to really solve a lot of problems. So again, like I said, it's just a super exciting development in medicine, and we're going to keep hearing about this for many, many years and decades to come.
Excellent. We have about 4 more minutes, so as any thoughts kind of come to anyone's mind, please jump in. But Dr. O, in terms of flu, talk to us about the flu season, the interaction with viruses, sick, flu, 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 what's cooking?
Yeah, so for influenza, this is the season, and we started to see an uptick in cases. I think the important thing to highlight is the flu looks like COVID. COVID looks like flu. Yes, there's some distinguishing things like loss of taste and smell are kind of unique to COVID as against influenza. But some of the concerns would be that going into the flu season, and not just the flu season, it's a respiratory virus season. There's RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, there's rhinovirus, there's other ones that do circulate in the colder months of the year. My concern is that if we have a COVID flare at a time where other viral infections are flaring, when a patient presents to the emergency room, they're undifferentiated. They could have the flu, but because of the concerns for COVID, we're going to isolate them, keep doing all kinds of testings. Emergency rooms are going to be clogged. And we know that sometimes bad outcomes with COVID are not just driven by you're so sick, but the fact that the health system can't accommodate the medical needs you have as your disease becomes very severe. So I think that's why we all continue to emphasize that, you continue to take your flu vaccine, COVID vaccine. We've not seen any reason why you can't receive both of those at the same time so that one doesn't interact with the other. And now that we know the COVID vaccines are safe, there's no need to say, well, I want to see how I feel. We think that you should be fine. Just get both at the same time, especially if that's the schedule that you have with getting the COVID or the flu vaccine. So really to get the word out. One thing I'm also concerned about is we didn't have a flu season last year, essentially, because there was kind of a little more fidelity to masking and some of the COVID-19 precautions, and that served us well for flu. But I think now that there's a lot more mask fatigue, a lot more people are dropping their masks, I think there's the opportunity is just ripe for flu to surge. So my word to everyone is get your flu shot. I got my flu shot on election day. There was a vaccine clinic when I went to go vote in November. That was very nice, and I got mine. And so please get your flu shot, get your COVID shot, get them together. Let's try to really attack the respiratory virus season this year.
We have 2 more minutes. Reverend Perry, any thoughts as we wind down?
Well, I would ask Dr. O about the flu shot for young people. What age would you think they should start with giving the flu shot to young people?
Yeah, everyone should get the flu shot. There's really no age cutoff for the flu shots. I mean, there's different pediatric formulations, inhaled and injectable, forms of the vaccine. Again, there's robust data in some of those. I think for some younger participants, there may be a 2-dose flu vaccine schedule. I think there's some guidance for some of that, but everyone should get the vaccine because, again, younger children, pregnant women, older individuals tend to be disproportionately impacted by the most severe forms of influenza.
And Dr. O, are African Americans now taking the vaccine more so than when we started out in this journey?
We're still the lower, one of the lowest racial groups. I think even in Connecticut, Blacks are proportionally to their representation in the community are the least vaccinated racial group. So I don't think, yes, everyone's vaccine hesitancy has dropped, but every poll shows that Blacks compared to every other race tend to express much more less willingness to receive the COVID vaccine. And we're seeing it in receptivity of the COVID vaccine and even other vaccines like influenza. So again, I think we need to get the word out to our communities. I worry that because COVID has already disproportionately impacted us. If we continue to use the vaccine less, we're going to have even more disproportionate representation in severe illnesses and hospitalizations and deaths in the future. So this is our moment, and I hope that everyone listening on this show and program, and those of you who will take the message again back to your communities and be that megaphone, that you get the word out that these vaccines are safe. They work as well in Blacks as they work in whites, as well as Latinx individuals. They work in whites. It works well for everyone. Let's take it.
Gentlemen,
excellent.
We have to do this again. We have to do this again. Really, thank you so much.
As I got another rhyme, another rhythm for y'all to listen. I'm never quitting on my mission. I'm gonna roll with what I'm giving.
This is Harry Grove, and you're listening to WNHHLP 103.5 FM New Haven.
Better go in the right direction. In the moment you stressing, but you gonna be counting blessings. And I know that for certain. Keep on working, open curtains. Haters swerving, cause they ain't ready for your final version. I'm never gonna give up. Fall down, I just gotta get up, yeah. Cause this is my road. Let's camera